Hey, what's up, everyone? It's your boy Dick, and this is a very special episode of the Put Me Over podcast. In fact, this is a bonus episode covering the Dark Side of the Ring documentary, Brian Pillman. This is something that I've been wanting to do for a while for two reasons. Number one, the Vice documentaries are just fantastic. There has not been a bad episode, and with the Brian Pillman episode, it's no exception. And number two, speaking of Brian Pillman, he is such a fascinating person. Um, a recurring theme throughout the Vice documentaries is what could have been had tragedy not been involved. And uh, I thought Vice did an excellent job documenting Brian's life, having his children there. Melanie was also involved, and I got a lot to say about Melanie. Uh, Kim Wood is a very fascinating character, very fascinating person. To me, Kim Wood made this documentary. Just the guy's one-liners are just are hilarious, and uh, the way he thinks of Vince McMahon and Eric Bischoff, you just got to listen to him and listen to his responses. It's I can't even describe it into words. And then you got Jim Ross and Jim Cornette. You can't have a documentary without Jim Ross. And just real quickly, I did watch the Stone Cold documentary. I'm glad they had Jim Ross in there, even though it was mainly WWE centric. You got to have Jim Ross when you're talking about Stone Cold. It's they're connected for a reason, and Jim Ross did an excellent job filling in because I mean he was there when he signed Brian Pillman in WCW in the mid to late '80s, and he was also part of the team that brought him over to WWE in the '90s. Jim Cornette, the same thing as well. I know Jim Cornette's a very polarizing figure, and my opinion of Jim Cornette is not very good. But the one thing I will say about Jim Cornette rather, is that he knows his stuff. He has a photographic memory when it comes to wrestling. You can tell him a date and a time, and he'll tell you exactly what happened. So that's the one thing I will say about Jim Cornette is that I mean one positive thing I will say is that he knows his stuff. And then you have Dave Meltzer. A lot of polarizing opinions about Dave, but um, the same thing I'll say with Dave about Jim is that Dave knows his stuff. He keeps excellent notes. He has a very great memory, and he knows how to document stuff. And um, he was also friends with Brian and Kim, and he gave a lot of backstory that maybe a lot of people didn't really realize at the time. So really a bunch of eye-opening stuff. And right off the bat, they went in and go into Brian's childhood. This guy had over 30 throat surgeries during his childhood. So yeah, that's a pretty traumatic experience for anyone. I mean, for a child going through, maybe let alone one surgery, going through 30, that's something. And then on top of that, there was a period where he did not talk for 3 weeks in between surgery. So yeah, that's gonna do something to a child's psyche. And then they go into, him playing for the Cincinnati Bengals, and that's where he met Kim Wood. Kim Wood was at the time he was a strength coach for the Bengals. He was very renowned through the NFL. He's had many books written about uh, strength and conditioning, and on top of that, his philosophy in life. And the one thing I've noticed about Kim Wood is that he can spot bullshit, and he is not a fan of Vince McMahon or Eric Bischoff. And throughout this documentary, he does not hide from it. Uh, and the way that he responds from his answers, I just thought that was just hilarious. Kim Wood is entertaining as hell. And just on a side note, it was on the Wrestling Observer Radio. I think it was as of last Friday, and it was Friday the 26th, if I'm not mistaken. Uh, Dave Meltzer and Gary Gonzalez, they go into detail about this episode. And one of the things that I got from that one was that Kim Wood is a very articulate person. He read a lot of books on con men, So that's probably the reason why he spotted a lot of the bullshit that came from both Vince McMahon and Eric Bischoff. So I thought that was really interesting. Um, Another thing I noticed about the documentary, and I just want to mention something real quick, is this documentary went into detail about the Hollywood Blondes and both Pillman and Austin's run in WCW. And that was something missing from the Steve Austin documentary. They did not even touch on it. They barely touched on the Hollywood Blondes. And I'm glad they went into the Hollywood Blondes during this era. And you talk about an underrated tag team in the early 90s. Steve Austin and Brian Pillman, that was all them. That was actually Brian. And Austin talks about it, how this was Brian's idea. Now, the Hollywood Blondes were an old tag team from back in the day, and Brian wanted to reuse the gimmick for him and Steve, even though neither were from California. Steve is from Texas, and Brian's from Cincinnati, and it worked for both those guys. We started seeing Steve coming to the ring and doing the camera roll, and they made it work. The problem was that it didn't last very long, and it was a Clash of the Champions in '93 where it was him and Pillman versus Flair and Arn, and that clash didn't do so well, and we see both Pillman and Austin being broken up. Austin, kind of obscured in mediocrity in WCW. Pillman more or less the same thing, and he did eventually find his way into the Four Horsemen, where he became a Horseman member. And it was around this time where we started seeing more of the loose cannon and how he really wanted to develop his character. Because the one thing Pillman knows is that in WCW, he had to do something. He had to change. He had to make himself stand out. And yeah, he had the athleticism and he had the look, but like he really wasn't much of a promo guy at the time. And he knew that he had to make himself different from everyone else. And when he came up with the loose cannon and we started doing like just this unhinged wrestler, a really unhinged person, because it became reality after a while, and a lot of people weren't sure, like, is this guy nuts or is this a work? And I just thought he blurred the lines so well. And a common analogy that I got from this episode was it was very Kaufman-esque, and I could see that. I looked like Pillman was a big fan of Andy Kaufman and the way that he blurred the lines not only in comedy but also in wrestling. If you go back and watch Andy Kaufman back in the Memphis days, he blurred the lines a lot, and even his stand-up comedy, he you couldn't really tell which was serious and which was real. And I mean, one of the first early glimpses of the loose cannon gimmick was wrestling a match with Eddie Guerrero, where Pillman went outside the ring and he went behind Bobby Heenan. Bobby Heenan had some serious neck problems, and Heenan pretty much shot on live camera saying, "What the fuck are you doing?" Like he didn't know, and Heenan walked away, came back, apologized, and that's when Pillman knew I got something, because he worked Heenan, and Heenan didn't know how to respond. So that's how really the loose cannon gimmick really came to be. They go into they talk about how him and Kevin Sullivan were fighting, and obviously the infamous line, "I respect you, Booker man," just tremendous. Uh, it was later revealed that it was all work between Sullivan and Pillman, even though it looked like there were elements of they were really going at it. They were like, especially in that match where Sullivan was trying to gouge Pillman's eye out, and a lot of people were thinking, "Oh man, this is real," because when you go for someone's eye, you're trying to take them out. Um, but again, it was revealed by Kim Wood, and when Kim Wood was talking to Meltzer, that no, this was a work. I'm sorry, Sullivan would not gouge anyone's eye during a bar fight. So I think that was really interesting. And they go into his love life. Pillman has had many women. He was a ladies' man, and he had 5 kids through three different women, and the kids were involved in the documentary. I felt really bad for Brittany. Brittany was Rochelle's mother, and she talks about how Melanie was kind of like the driving force to take the kids away from Rochelle. Rochelle's had a really tragic life, and uh, they talked about her being stabbed, but by a gardener in Atlanta with an ice pick. That's pretty fucking crazy, if you ask me. That is wow. And going back to Melanie, how Melanie would try to take Rochelle's kids away from her. And Brittany was telling the story of how when she was young, that she was playing outside, and this was at a time where Rochelle was not allowed to visit them. So this was not all on Melanie, but rather Brian was also responsible for not having Rochelle visit her kids. And going back to Brittany, she was telling a story about how she was playing outside, and her her mother Rochelle came by to visit her and gave her a hug, and they were reconnecting. When Melanie saw what happened, she wanted to file charges against Rochelle for coming to visit. And you talk about just being very petty to her. That's something. And it wasn't the reason why she committed suicide, but rather it was the catalyst where Rochelle ended up taking her own life, and that was really sad. And you could tell that Brittany hates Melanie. Like that was I mean, I really can't blame her, to be honest with you. Like when you're that young and you start seeing, you know, someone who is not your parent, but a step parent interfering with stuff like that, and then it leads to the death of the parent. I mean, what else are you gonna think? Of course, Brittany's not gonna forgive Melanie, and that's just something that was just not cool. And throughout this episode, it really painted Melanie in a very bad light, and a lot of it was her own doing. And that was something I think she understood, was that, I made a lot of mistakes in my past, and hopefully, I can be, hopefully they'll forgive me. And it takes a lot of time for stuff like that to to forgive someone. And man, that really bothered me when that happened, when Brittany was telling the story. But yeah, there's a lot more about Melanie I want to get into, so we'll come back to that. Um, During WCW, as I mentioned, Pillman knew that he had to make himself stand out, and um, at the same time, he also knew that he needed money, and he wasn't gonna be, he had to find some way of making money. So this is such a genius of Brian Pillman, was that he tricked Eric Bischoff into signing a release for him, an actual legal release, to get out of his WCW contract. So that way he can go to WWE. Now Bischoff claims that that he was in on it, that he authorized Pillman to sign the release to go to WWE, but then come back to WCW and get more money. Now, this was at the time, and the reason why Bischoff thought that was because he just signed Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. And when they signed Kevin Nash, they had the favored nations clause, where if anyone made top money, Scott and or Kevin were going to get that. And I think Bischoff was probably thinking, well, if I can use that to my advantage, Brian can come back and I can use the favorite clause on him to pay him what he wanted, because Brian wanted about 400 or so, 450, and Bischoff was only going to offer him 200. Well, Pillman ended up working with Bischoff to get, or at least that's what Bischoff claims, to get an actual release. Pillman then goes to ECW, and to me cuts one of the best promos I've ever seen, and where he just pretty much shits on the Smart Mark, he shits on Bischoff, shits on ECW, to the point where he pulls his dick out and tries to take a piss in the ring, only to be interrupted by Shane Douglas, Todd Gordon, and Paul Heyman. Um, it's up on YouTube. If you haven't seen it, you got to watch it. It's one of the best promos I think I've ever seen in my life, and it catches the essence of the loose cannon character because you don't know what you were going to get. Pillman eventually finds his way over to WWE, but before he goes to WWE, that's when they get into the Humvee incident, and Pillman was just not the same after that. Like physically, not only physically, but mentally, he was just not the same person. He had wrecked his body. He had pins throughout. He had pins stuck in his leg. It looked. It was gruesome. And I remember when I was younger. I remember he did get involved in an accident, but the way that they explained it in this documentary was just. It was brutal. It was sad to see someone who was going to WWE, going to have a promising career, and then only to be cut short because of a car accident. And his sister, and I think a lot of people realize that if that didn't happen, maybe he still would have been alive. And it's just one of those things where, like, what could have been? What could have been had this not happened? Um, but real quickly, I want to go back to Kim Wood, and Kim Wood has had, he's had tremendous one-liners throughout this episode, and the interviewer asked Kim, "What did you think of Vince?" Like straight out, and Kim's response, "Vince, what would you do with a whore? You fuck him." I died. I died laughing because Kim Wood gets it. He understands the business. You're in it to make money. You're not in it to do anything else other than to make money. And if you are, then what the fuck are you doing? So I get where he's coming from. And he's 100% right in that situation, especially when you have two companies who at the time were competing to get talent. This was still in the middle of this was in the early stages of the Monday Night War. Pillman was smart enough to realize, hey, wait a minute, I can play both sides and get more money. And Bischoff thought, and again, going back to Bischoff, he thought like, oh well, I'm gonna work with Brian only for Brian to trick him into signing that clause. And it's just funny that Bischoff was trying to defend it, like, well, I knew what I was doing, but everyone else was saying otherwise. So I just thought that was really, 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 really funny. But man, it's just like it's just a recurring theme throughout this episode. What could have been, and they did go into the Humvee incident, just how he just was not the same after. They talk about the infamous Austin breaking into Pillman's house, which to me is the greatest home invasion angle ever and the most controversial angle that WWE has ever done, to the point where they've had to apologize the following week. I believe on Livewire, Vince McMahon had to go on Livewire to apologize for the angle. Yeah, maybe you should also apologize for Katie Vick as well, and just how horrendous Monday Night Raw has been. I would love to see more of that. I'd like to see him apologize for that stuff. Um, but the Brian Pillman, Steve Austin home invasion angle, as and you know what's funny is that the company has tried to imitate that to a far less result, far less successful rather. Triple H and Randy Orton back in 2009, they tried to do the same thing, and it was nowhere close because Pillman was so unhinged at the time, and he couldn't tell if it was real or fake, and that's what made it so beautiful, and that's what you couldn't be duplicated. You could not duplicate that angle, no matter how hard you tried. So I thought that was really interesting. Another thing was um, Pillman's sister Linda talked about how during the time he was at WWE, just this is how bad Pillman was. That he would be hooked up to his IV at home, but when you go to work, you take the IV off, go to work, come back home, put it back in. While at the same time, his painkiller addiction was just getting bad. It was getting to the point where like he was high all the time, and Jim Ross had wanted him to do a drug test because just he felt that Pillman was just spiraling out of control, and you could tell that that's when Jim and Brian had a falling out. Oh, and a real story, interesting story that I think Jim Ross has explained before. I'm not sure where it was. I forgot which documentary it was, but Jim Ross told the story of how might have been in WCW where Brian takes a giant shit. I don't know what is it with wrestlers and shit, but he takes a giant shit and he calls JR to the bathroom. He's like, "Hey, I got something to show you." JR gives this line, and I can't remember what documentary it's from, but he says that it was about 18 inches long, and I was just like really I don't know why I thought about that right now, but yeah, I don't. It's just again goes to show you what kind of person that Brian Pillman is. Like he's just not only that, but also the with wrestlers and shit. I just thought that was just I thought that was just out there, but but I digress. A couple other things I do want to mention. We're getting toward the end. You could tell that Brian's life was just it was just spiraling out of control, and they go into Bad Blood, 1997. That was the pay per view with probably the greatest Hell in the Cell match of all time. Uh, Jim Cornette was telling the story of how that people had to show up a couple hours for check-in, but he noticed that Brian wasn't there. So he calls the hotel in which Brian was staying, and the front clerk informs him that Brian passed away. And Cornette's first reaction was that he's playing us, that he is working all of us, and only to find out that he realizes no, like he really is dead. So and you could tell, like when Cornette was explaining the story, that it still bothered him to this day, and that was well over 23 years ago. And that's just, I mean, again, going back with Brian Pillman, you never know what to expect, whether um, if he's shooting or if it's a work, you can't tell. And the loose cannon gimmick just blurred into reality, um, and with all these things as well, the Humvee accident, the painkiller addiction, it ended up costing him his life, and he died at such a young age, 37 years old. And again, it's a recurring theme throughout these Vice documentaries of what could have been. Uh, and I look back at it and I'm like, how different would the Attitude Era have been if we had Brian Pillman who was 100% healthy with the loose cannon gimmick, Steve Austin, Mick Foley, a healthy Shawn Michaels, The Rock, and Kurt Angle. How different would the Attitude have ever been? You know, it's just again what could have been. And they also did talk about the infamous interview with Melanie Pillman the week after Brian's death, and unsurprisingly, it did win the worst promotional tactic in 1997 on the Wrestling Observer newsletter, and Melanie explains that she did not want to, like she felt very uncomfortable doing the interview. The first thing she told Vince was, please do not ask about Brian's drug addiction. And what does Vince do? Ask about Brian's drug problems. And you can tell that Melanie was so uncomfortable with that segment. And in all honesty, I can't really blame her. When your loved one has died, and then all of a sudden you're getting asked all these questions that are really too invasive. Vince had no right to ask these questions, let alone to conduct this interview. He did it to obviously pop a rating and to capitalize on the death of Brian. That was really tasteless. And Melanie, she did do a lot of bad things as well, and her life also did spiral out of control, even more so. Uh, it got to the point where even the children were accusing her of taking Brian's royalties and using it on drugs and alcohol to fuel her drug habit. And Melanie didn't deny the claim, and that she did go through some real personal problems. She did end up remarrying another person, and Brian Jr. even told about the story about his childhood, and how traumatizing it was for him, uh, being abused by his stepdad. His mother was really just fucked up all the time, using Brian's royalties to pay for her addiction. And it was really sad to see the children go from how they were with Brian when was alive to kind of just like struggling. And it was through no fault of their own. And as you see that story developing and how it was explained, yeah, you can understand why the children resent Melanie so much, because of her decisions and how it affected them. And there was one good thing. I mean, the one thing I'll say about this is that it makes Brian Jr. look like a baby face, and you want to cheer for Brian. You want to cheer for Brian Jr. because he it's really sad to see how he grew up. His dad was he barely didn't know his dad because his dad died when he was young, and then going through that childhood and that traumatic childhood that he had to go through and endure from his stepfather. And now he wants to become a professional wrestler, and AEW has now signed him. And he even mentioned that um, what started it was him getting a phone call from Steve Austin, and Steve just happened to go through his closet one day, and he found a weightlifting belt that Brian owned. And he called his son and says, "I think you should have it." And this is where how we see Brian Jr. becoming a professional wrestler. Like it became the catalyst. And like I said, this is something that you want to cheer, because Brian Jr. just went through a very traumatic childhood, and how can you boo the kid? But yeah, just to finish it up, like I said, overall tremendous documentary by Vice. They have not done a terrible documentary at all, and if you get a chance, please go out and watch it. It's about an hour and 45 minutes, but it is worth your time, even if you're not a Brian Pillman fan, but you're a wrestling fan in general. I would recommend it. Um, Is it better than any of the A&E documentaries? I mean, I saw the Stone Cold documentary and the Piper documentary. I think I mean, I don't want to, I hate comparing those two because they're really different, to be honest with you. You can only compare the Pillman episodes to all the other documentaries that Vice has done. And it's not the best one, but it's by no means the worst one. I mean, it's up there. It's absolutely up there. I think it's up there with Owen and the Chris Benoit documentary as well. So yes, absolutely. If you get a chance, please check it out, and tell us what you think. And furthermore, tell us what you think of this, and if this is something you guys wouldn't mind listening to, then this might become a recurring theme throughout the season of Dark Side of the Ring. So I'm looking forward to you guys, and hopefully, we'll get our regular episode up sometime this week. But until then, you guys just take care. We'll talk to you guys soon. Later.